The Mitch Debrief, and let's look at issues now with regards to Egypt. We know that Egypt over time has over a few days now has reported a lot of uprisings. We've seen hundreds of people killed in the area. We were looking at how this is affecting the country, the issue of safety, security for even foreigners in that country. With me in the studio is the ambassador of Egypt to Ghana, Omar Salim. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for allowing me to come on your news today.
Absolutely. Now, we already know of a crisis in Egypt, if we could call it that, but how is it affecting the country, especially when it comes to relations to other countries, foreigners within the country?
Well, first of all, let me clarify one thing. We don't consider it as a crisis at the moment, but we are witnessing a second wave of the Egyptian revolution. The Egyptian revolution started in 2011 and it's going on, and it will continue until the revolution is achieving all its goals. Unfortunately, during the past few years, the Egyptian revolution did not achieve its goals, but by the contrary, it was going on a wrong path. Instead of getting a modern, democratic state, we were going through a religious state. We were going in a path that doesn't fulfill the aspiration of the Egyptian people. Unfortunately, it was not portrayed that exact way on the international media. On the 30th of June, we witnessed 30 million Egyptians coming on the street and saying, no, we cannot continue this way. 23 million Egyptians signed a petition called Rebellion. They were asking for early presidential election or a referendum for the president either to continue his mandate or not, and to install a partial government to oversee the elections and the referendum. But unfortunately, there was a deaf ear to all these calls, and the army at that moment had to intervene in rescue of the current situation in Egypt. We were going to have an even worse situation that we have now, much worse. We could have been going through a path where people will be starting to have a large-scale fight on the streets. But fortunately enough, the army responded to the call of the Egyptian people, the Egyptian Al-Azhar al-Sharif, and the Egyptian church. And that's why we have now a new roadmap that is going to be in place, and we started to go to have some more steps now in this roadmap, so I think we are on the right path. Unfortunately, we have some troubles on the street because the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhoods are coming up with arms. They have been mixing politics with terrorism, so this is not an acceptable situation for the Egyptian population. Last few weeks we saw protesters or so-called peaceful protesters using arms, machine guns, machetes, Molotov cocktails in the street. So this was a very unfortunate situation. And 2 days ago, we had 25 Egyptian, just normal soldiers, massacred in the Sinai. They took them out of the bus that was carrying them, made them stay in one line, and were just cold-bloodedly killed.
The numbers who have those killed so far, we still haven't been able to. There is a division over the figure of people who have died so far. How many people have died so far since this revolution?
You can say from the civilian population, you can talk about 600 from the civilian population, and over 100 between policemen and police officers.
Is this the price for a change?
Unfortunately, we had to pay this price, but I call on everyone in Egypt for a reason, for especially the Muslim Brotherhood, to drop down their arms and move on with the Egyptian population. The Egyptian people are looking for a modern state. We don't want to mix the arms with politics, and this is not an acceptable situation.
Do you regret the ousting of Morsi?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because if we were to build the future of Egypt, he had to be ousted at that time.
Right. Now, let's look at safety in Egypt right now. What would be your assessment of security in Egypt, especially for foreigners?
Actually, we didn't have any problem or any foreigner that had been in jeopardy or injured for the time being. And the curfew right now is in Cairo imposed from 7 o'clock and sometimes 9 o'clock till the second day at 6 o'clock in the morning. So this curfew is a preventive measure right now to not have people moving arms around the country. And I think the situation is improving unless we have something else that erupts. What I can tell you that all airports are functioning completely normally. Air traffic is completely normal. Buses and metros are working the same hours until the curfew time. But we hope that we don't see more incitement to violence in the coming few days.
Right. We've seen what's happened in other countries where the ousting of leaders then led to, one uprising after the other, and then we came to full-blown wars, and then we've seen how it has affected, women and children especially. What is it for Egypt? What is it that you see happening in Egypt soon?
No, Egypt, we see a bright future, actually. And most of the population is quite optimistic because the last year was quite difficult for the Egyptian people. We were not going the right way. So I think this is the proper channel that we have to go through, and I'm very optimistic myself.
Is that the only solution? Is that the only solution to change? Is that the only way we can have change in Egypt?
Well, for example, one of the problems we had was the constitution. This constitution gives discrepancies doesn't give equal rights for Muslim and non-Muslim, for example, Muslim and Christians, and doesn't give equal rights between men and women. All the regulatory authorities and monitoring authorities in Egypt and the press and media were appointed by the president. So that we saw how can you build a state? How can you have someone monitoring the government, monitoring the president himself, monitoring the ministries, if he's appointed himself and he can be removed himself by the president? Unfortunately, Mr. Morsi, during the year of term he stayed in Egypt, he gave himself some decrees that were exceeding the powers of any other ruler in the history. He gave immunity to his past, his present, and his future decrees from being, contested by law. So it was unacceptable by the Egyptian people at the time. So we didn't remove Mubarak to bring someone else who is going to empower himself with much more powers that were stipulated in the constitution.
Observing, I feel Egypt at the moment is a syphilis. It's not clear who is in charge of what goes on in Egypt. Everybody wants to have a bit of the control, and hence the uprisings. Paint a picture of Egypt, what the state of Egypt is at the moment.
Well, let me tell you, the government is going now in a way to improve the livelihood of Egyptians. And this also goes along, with security. So we have three tracks. We have political reforms to improve the climate and get a proper constitution. The economic reform, which is going to improve the livelihood of the normal citizens who are aspiring for a better future, and the security situation on the streets. Unfortunately, since the ousting of Dr. Morsi, we had over 20 churches that were burned, and over 40 buildings that are in a way affiliated with the church that were either ransacked or being burned. So we don't want this kind of picture to be portrayed by Egypt, because we as Muslims in Egypt now and Christians, we are all together sitting and protecting the churches. And this was a very nice scene to see how we are all together. We don't make discrimination, who is a Muslim, who is a Christian. So this is the future we're looking for our children.
We've heard that some mosques have had to accommodate some dead bodies because the mosques couldn't take the numbers anymore.
Actually, strangely enough, when the police entered the sit-ins in Rabaa, they found under the main stage from which there was the sitting being controlled, they found some bodies that were there for a few days with ice on them, and some of them were buried under there. So it was quite a mystery. And police actually is investigating how these bodies have been there, and they've been there even before the police entered the sit-ins there.
Right. Let's come back to here in the country. How has, all of the uprisings in Egypt affected your work here in the country?
Well, not only me, but mainly most of the Egyptians are quite sad about the unfair treatment that Egypt had on the international media. We see it was not objective, and it was always portrayed as the army going after the Muslim Brotherhood, which was not the case. We saw on our national TV and live on air last Saturday and last Friday the so-called peaceful protesters, and they were walking in the streets with machine guns and weapons, and that was quite difficult for us. So I think that all Egyptians are trying now to present to the world the truth about what is going on in Egypt, the truth that the Egyptians are taking back again their revolution in the hands. They want to build their country properly.
What do you make of the interference of the West, especially the U.S.?
Well, each country is looking at it from a different angle and according to their interest. But we as Egyptians, we are looking where our interest is. We are always talking with our friends in the outside world. We don't have enemies, but we have a very useful dialogue with the U.S., with the European Union, with the African countries, and the African Union that visited Egypt. And we are trying always to explain what is going on, and we're trying to give them the possibility to come and look on the ground and see what is going in Egypt exactly. So I think this is also a very good step for us to go in that area.
Is there an end in sight?
There is a roadmap. This roadmap has few steps on it. The first step is the amending the constitution to give the proper constitution. The second one is to hold a referendum on this constitution, parliamentary elections, and then presidential elections. This roadmap is the contrary of the one that we had before, in which we had an elected president that we don't know what powers he's going to have. So this time we're taking the right way to go. And we call on everyone to be reasonable in Egypt, everyone to contribute to the process. And actually this process is open to everyone. There is no veto about anyone joining the process. The government is now there and reaching out with its hands and telling everyone, please come and join the process. This is our country, we have to build it together.
Which is the most important message? I would have loved us to talk about Hosni Mubarak, but would leave that for another time. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your time this
Thank you very much.
afternoon. We've been talking to Egyptian Ambassador to Ghana, Omar Salim, rather. And let's move on to, you're still watching the midday brief. When I return, we'll do some more stories.